Oh, ho, ho, ho. Here we are, folks. What is it? It's almost the new year, 2022, but here we are yet before Christmas. And I'm sporting my Christmas attire. Um, if you follow my channel at all, you'll know that I'm a big kind of user, if you will, of the themes that happen through the year. So around Christmas time and the new year, that's a huge theme for everybody, especially at this time in our lives where we're going through the pandemic, we're going through problems internationally, pending wars, all sorts of things. So the holidays, and especially a holiday like this, Christmas and the New Year, are significant. Um, Today, I want to do something that can be a little controversial. But now that I'm a bit in between chapters of my life, if you will, I have the freedom to do that. And based upon that theme, I want to talk today about what I call bearing the burden of liberty. Now, before I jump into that, and you'll want to stay tuned because what I'm going to jump into is some of the ideas right now going around vaccination, tying that to issues of other things that we experience as human beings, and that connection to freedom and to liberty and what it means to live in a free world. And so, the conclusions that I come to are, after having been a counselor for 33 years, and doing tons and tons of training, and really kind of practicing, researching, and just being involved in the discipline of really trying to see things from a bigger perspective, sometimes what we call transpersonal psychology. To me, that involves all sorts of depth psychology and things that help us look deeper into the human condition. So that could range from anything from Buddhism to Taoism to Christianity to mythology of all kinds, that I've reached into to come to the conclusions that I come to, and to kind of develop the ideas that I use to ground my own life. And I also teach these things, and of course, what I'm teaching again is hopefully maybe a kind of a different twist on really some really uh, deep wisdom teachings that have been around forever. I'm a big fan of that. A big fan of Jungian psychology, mythology, as I mentioned, transpersonal psychology, theology. So again, my name is John Solano. I've been a practicing counselor for 33 years, and so now that I'm between chapters in my life, I want to throw my hat in the ring um, around this topic of bearing the burden of liberty. And so what do I mean by that? Well, one of the things that, and I'm just gonna, what I get to do a little bit too is kind of express my biases a little bit, but because I am biased towards freedom, I am biased towards the human spirit. I'm biased towards the if you will, spark of divinity, or the spirit that lives within you, that lives within me, and the power of us all to change, to experience transformation, and 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 hence the that we need to create a space where we can do that, where we can go through that process. And so I'm like you, I'm kind of looking at what's going on in the world regarding COVID and where public policy seems to be headed. And one of the things that I find very, very concerning, from a lot of different perspectives, from a personal perspective, obviously, community perspective, national perspective, but also from a transpersonal spiritual perspective, is this. And that is that there is this narrative beginning to gain momentum that, first of all, of course, that there's a big push for everybody to get the vaccine, and we all know that this all started, where the vaccine was supposed to be useful for folks over the age of 65, compromised immune systems, et cetera. All of a sudden, that morphed into this idea that all adults needed to be vaccinated. And then that morphed into teenagers, and now, young kids. And now it's morphed into this kind of idea that, or I guess expanded into this idea that if people somehow aren't vaccinated or have chosen to exercise their freedom to not become vaccinated, that there's some sort of an outlaw, that there's something wrong with them. And we've heard our leaders even talk about how dangerous the non-vaxxers make our community. We know that that's not true, because we know that even people who are vaccinated can carry the virus just as much, just as easily as somebody who's unvaccinated. So if somebody's unvaccinated and they carry the virus, they're just as likely to spread it around as somebody else. You could have somebody who's vaccinated carrying the virus, and because they're vaccinated and they think they have this protection, that they could be making actually more contact with people in the community than somebody who's not vaccinated and who is taking greater precaution. So that's a fallacy in and of itself. And I guess people like to talk about that as false information or what have you that's out there that's spreading this narrative. But with that narrative that somehow the unvaccinated people are a danger to the community, there's this idea that if someone who is unvaccinated contracts COVID and ends up going to the hospital, that somehow they should suffer, that somehow they should not receive service or receive inadequate service, or be placed farther down the list as someone who needs service. Why is that? Because people who have not chosen to be vaccinated have done so of their free will choice. They've exercised a freedom that has caused them to experience adverse consequences. So the rationale around that is, well, if you've made a bad choice in your life, why should we as a community pay for that? Why should we experience any kind of inconvenience as a result of the bad choices that you've made? Now, whether or not getting vaccinated is a bad choice is the jury is still out on that. And so hopefully you're somebody who's looked at various sources of information, and not to say that the vaccination doesn't have some benefits, but there are also some really severe side effects that don't really get talked about unless you are tuning in to some other news sources. And again, that's been downplayed as part of this narrative that has ended up here in this place of really saying that as a human being, if you make a bad choice, then there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. And so attached to that, there is this shame and punishment idea, that if you make a bad choice that ends up putting yourself in jeopardy and takes a toll on the rest of the community, that somehow you're to be shamed and punished. It just reminds me of the Scarlet Letter, doesn't it? What are they going to do? Put a brand on you? Put the letter, V or whatever with a line through it to say that you're unvaccinated and you have to walk around the community with that stamped on you. I mean, this is a very, very old and very researched, very documented dynamic that we really need to stay away from. Again, this is not just in my perception, but as you see, I'm drawing upon history, and I'm drawing upon psychology, and I'm drawing upon transpersonal psychology to come to these conclusions. So here we are. So what do you think about that? So we live in a time where some of our leaders are beginning to light fire, if you will, to this idea, this narrative, that if you make bad choices in your life, ultimately, you're not going to get a good service. You're going to go to the bottom of the list, or you're going to be refused service. How's that sound for you? That should sound very concerning to you. That should sound very concerning to all of us. Well, why is that? Well, as I've said in many, many of my videos, a mature person understands the reality of the human condition. This is not a discussion we should even be having right now. Really, we should be well beyond this. We should all be understanding the reality of the human condition since the beginning of time. What is that condition? You know what it is. It's that we all fall short of perfection. We'll never reach it. All spiritual disciplines speak about this. If you're involved in any kind of ideology or anything that says that somehow you can reach a state of perfection, you're being led down the wrong road. All right. A mature person knows, and a lot of people like to say this, but only as a cliche, that we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. In other words, we all make choices that are not in our best interest. I've been researching since the 90s and sharing in many of my videos this dynamic called the dynamic of entitlement and indulgence. And I'm not going to go into that right now. Please look at the other videos, but it's the dynamic of entitlement and indulgence is very much embedded in the human psyche, and it's tied to a core part of the psyche that is narcissistic, egocentric, and grandiose. Okay, so what does it mean to be indulgent? To be indulgent means to be involved in any thought, process, or thing that creates adverse consequences. To willfully, that's super important to understand. An indulgence is a willful participation in any thought, process, or thing that creates adverse consequences. That's very similar to the definition of indulgence. But when I teach my courses, this is the definition of indulgence: to partake in any thought, process, or thing that creates adverse consequences. Well, if you understand the human condition, you understand that that is deeply embedded in our psyche. That's why we need to grow up. That's why we need to mature. That's why we need to be engaged in a discipline. I've said this many a time in my videos for parents and other people who want to explore the idea of what it means to become mature and the importance of entering into a discipline that helps us mature. It helps us to become less indulgent and to minimize, if you will, that feeling of entitlement. Well, right now we live in a time where that feeling of entitlement and indulgence is incredibly magnified. That's why I started my research back in the 90s on this dynamic, because I saw this tidal wave coming. And again, it's tied to narcissism, and narcissism is equated with somebody who's immature. So we're talking about the immature mind. All right. Now the narcissism, basically the manifestations of it mean that somebody thinks they're pretty darn special and they're all knowing, you know, and omnipotent, meaning all powerful, et cetera, that the world should revolve around them. Grandiose means feelings of godlike. And so part of maturing, it has to do with taking on a discipline that kind of shines the light on our character. And when it does that, we get to see all these imperfections that we talk about. We get to see our immaturities. We get to see our shortcomings. A mature person embraces that. Why? Because it creates humility. It creates authenticity. It creates integrity. We love to be around people who are authentic, who have integrity, who are humble, right? That standing in that place or becoming mature like that and holding close to your heart the understanding that none of us are perfect, that we all are indulgent. We all make choices that are not in our best interest, to put it politely. We all make choices that put ourselves in harm's way. We all make choices that take a toll on our mental health and our physical health. You know, I oftentimes in my workshops around the dynamic of entitlement and indulgence, I ask people, you know, think of indulgence as a guilty pleasure. What's something that you often engage in that you know you shouldn't be doing, that you shouldn't be engaged in it? And people can come up with, you know, with responses like, well, having a cigarette or smoking a joint, or, you know, having drinks, or vegging out on the couch, or doing a Netflix marathon, or, you know, people can come up with thousands of different ways that they indulge, rewards that they give themselves for having tolerated something, having put up with something. And the key here is that it's willful, so it's a free will choice, but it also will lead to somebody's depletion and and ultimately lead to their demise. All right. So in other words, it takes a toll on them. And when as human beings, we're depleted, we're not able to be our best self in the community and for our families and at work. And so other people also are impacted. See, but according to the government, that is going to be against the law. But it's the very nature of who we are as human beings. You see how dangerous that is? So now they're going to say, well, if you're going to exercise your freedom to not get the vaccination, and consequently your decision is taking a toll on the rest of the community, depleting the community of resources, taking the toll on the emotional kind of status of a community and of a nation, then you're going to be shamed and punished, and ultimately we're going to deprive you of the rights of your citizenship, the rights to who knows, to be treated fairly in a court of law, the rights to be treated fairly, for medical services. Your rights will be deprived or denied. But then, of course, that's going to go a little farther. Then they're going to say, well, you know what? If you're not exercising, 5 days a week for 30 minutes a day, you're a problem. If you're eating a bit too many cookies, or you're not eating your FDA approved amount of vitamins and minerals and vegetables and etc., that somehow you're depleting yourself, you're making poor choices, which is taking a toll on society, and you have no right to do that. So now you're going to be monitored. You're going to be denied rights. You see, this is a very slippery slope to go down. It's interesting, because I just spent, and I'll be spending one more day tomorrow, but I've spent 3 days in webinars, a series of webinars having to do with the impact, if you will, of substance use disorder and the family. So they call it SUD, right? And the family. And when it comes to the recovery community, substance abuse recovery in this particular situation, and I used to be a substance use counselor many, many years ago, so I know a bit about this. But just to say that we all know, whether you use substances or not, we can look around and see, the impact that substance abuse is causing the community, and what is causing to ourselves. So whether that's in the overdoses and things like this, that's causing a direct impact on social services and hospital services, which of course affects taxpayers, et cetera, which you and me, et cetera, or whether it might be somebody who chooses to loot your store, break into your home, break into your car. So there's definitely a toll being taken, right, by those folks who would be considered substance disordered, right? So whether they're on the extreme end and possibly and very much addicted, or whether it's somebody who's basically making some bad choices about their substance use, but not yet considered an addict. All I'm getting at here is that if the government chooses to say, hey, you know what, you're making some bad choices that are taking a toll. In fact, statistics show that the impact of substance abuse right now, like more lives are being taken through, if you want to say, the opioid, the fentanyl crisis right now than through COVID. So what's the deal there? Now you look at the recovery field, and the recovery field is working very strong right now, and has been for some time, to take the stigma out of being an addict or out of being a substance abuser. And now, that, I mean, the heat, if you will, the volume is being cranked up on that right now, but that's always been the case. In fact, that's the idea around, moving addiction, if you want to call it, to a disease model rather than a defect in character. So there's been a lot of work in that for 100 years probably, in this movement towards destigmatizing addiction, right? Taking the shame, the punishment out of being an addict. Why? Because it's an addiction. However, it's also true that people make choices. Now, people make choices to use for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes people, have predispositions for use, but somewhere in someone's life, there was a time when they did not use substances. And for whatever reason, they began that use. That was a choice. That was a choice. I don't think many people did that under direct duress. Although those folks who want to say that there's a strong correlation between trauma, in other words, emotional pain and addiction, might make an argument around that. But still to say, even when we're in pain, we've all experienced pain before. And we've all probably been tempted to turn towards certain things to alleviate that pain. Some of us say no, some of us say yes. That's a choice. Now, our ability to choose may be compromised, as I mentioned, for a lot of different reasons, but somewhere in there, there's choice. So what's to stop the government then from saying, you know what, this was a choice on your part. This was a choice. You're a bad person. In fact, you're the problem. You're the bane of existence right now. This is what the government is saying about unvaxxed people. People who are choosing to exercise a freedom, right? Now, we have to take the discussion to a bigger level, in my opinion. Like I said, we have to take this discussion to the level that this is the human condition. As human beings, we are deeply impacted. As I mentioned, it's in the core of our psyche to feel entitled and to be indulgent. That is a very unique dynamic to human beings alone. Okay? And we need to respect that. We need to look deeper into that. I mean, this is really the conversation we should be having. We're having some really old conversations, and we need to have these kinds of conversations, right? Let's look a little deeper into this. Let's kind of get an elevated position on this. As I mentioned earlier, anybody who is mature knows that this is the human condition. So what do we do about this? If it is true, John, I get the question, if it's true, John, and it's something that I've wrestled with, right? I mean, as a counselor, I've had to sit in the presence of suffering for over 30 years of my life. I've done that willingly, to sit in the presence not only of suffering, but of people who are making bad choices that cause their suffering. Now, I could talk about those folks, but I'm in the same boat. We all are in the same boat, but some of us maybe are a little bit farther down the road. Anyway, that's another discussion. But to say, we need to come to terms with that human part of ourselves, that human condition. Well, how do we do that? Well, one of those, talk about the season, one of those things has to do with forgiveness. Well, how do we forgive? How do we forgive those folks who have chosen the freedom to not vax? Again, that's another thing. Like I said, I mean, if the people who are unvaxxed actually put people at risk just by simply being unvaxxed, that would be a different conversation. But they don't put people at risk any more than anybody else does. But how do we come to terms with this? That as human beings, we are incredibly indulgent. We feel incredibly entitled. There's a core of narcissism within us that always is trying to move towards instant gratification. In other words, according to the season we're in now, we're naughty. That's why Santa exists, as I said in my recent video on the case for Santa, because that is the human condition. We're naughty. So that's what the, Santa Claus is coming to town song is all about. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. The little devil and the little angel that sits on our shoulders. Right? Our best self and our ornery, naughty self. Right? That's what we deal with. That's the human condition. So how do we deal with that? Well, as I mentioned, forgiveness. How do we forgive? Well, I don't want to go too deep into that, although I do unpackage that in some of my videos. I did a specific video on forgiveness, and I help people understand that. But one of the ways to be able to forgive somebody faster, if you will, is to see that you yourself are doing what they're doing. Because before forgiveness shows up, we usually think that we're not doing what that person does. Now, again, this might frustrate people or anger people because they're saying, well, I was abused or neglected or whatever. How am I doing that? That's a bigger therapeutic conversation. All right. And it's a conversation really that can only be useful to those people who have some spiritual curiosity, I'll call it for now, because any kind of self-exploration or awareness, what's the point? The point of it is to become aware, is to find out things that you didn't know before. So know that there's a price to admission. Like, don't go through the door of self-reflection if you don't want to find out something about yourself that you might not completely appreciate. That's a whole other discussion, how we do that, but that's what mature people do. Mature people go on the hunt for, where they're out of integrity, right? And they do it, and they know how to do it from a sense of humility and a sense of appreciation. An immature person can't do that. An immature person, first of all, is afraid of doing self-exploration. They'll point the finger at everybody else and say everybody else needs to do it, but they won't claim their own projections. They won't employ any kind of a discipline that puts them back into a place of personal accountability and responsibility. So in forgiveness, if I can see that the person I'm frustrated with, that I've got grievances against, if I can see that I'm more similar to them than different, then I'm more likely to forgive. So forgiveness. As I said, there may be a person who is utilizing their free choice to not become vaccinated, and they have their reasons for that. And yet, me or you, we might be choosing to partake in some other indulgence, if you want to call it indulgence. We might be involved in some other activity that puts ourselves in harm's way. Maybe we're not getting to the gym. Maybe we're not spending time in meditation or prayer. Maybe we're not spending time with our families. Maybe we're not going to temple or church. There can be a lot of different things that we could be doing that aren't good for us. As I said, you might be somebody who's come home from a long day's work and you think, I'm just going to veg out on the couch. And then that becomes a habit. I'm just going to smoke a joint. I'll just have this glass of wine. And now it's a habit. And it's taking its toll. Maybe you're not as sharp at work as you used to be. Maybe you're not as present with your wife or your husband or your kids as you used to be. It's taking its toll. And other people are paying the price with you. You see? Where this leads us ultimately is it leads us to understanding that we all must bear each other's burdens, which is the burden of liberty. It's the burden of freedom. Now, if you want to be all pissed off about bearing these burdens, then what happens usually is that people try to download those burdens to the government. And what does the government do? The government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They create more and more rules and laws and legislation. And all of a sudden they start to monitor you, all in the name of what? All in the name of safety. What safety? Safety that you asked for. See, people don't want to bear the burdens. Because why? Because we feel entitled. We feel entitled to our, whatever you want to call it, our peace of mind, our peace. We want our piece of the pie. And so we don't want to bear each other's burdens. But why would we want to bear each other's burdens? Because we're mature, because we understand that this is the price to freedom. This is what it means to be mature. This is what it means to live in a free world. If you don't want to live in a free world, then you're going to live in a dictatorship, and you're going to be monitored, and you're going to have laws, and people are going to do the thinking for you. And if you try to think anything for yourself, excuse me, you're going to be hushed. You might even be, I was going to say executed, but we can't say that, can we? You might just disappear, is what happens when people who live in places where they're not, where they think things they're not supposed to think and say things they're not supposed to say. It gets scary, folks, right? There is a price we all have to pay, and a burden we all have to carry for one another for the sake of liberty and for the sake of freedom. And the only way we can do that is to stand in the presence of something that brings us into humility. In other words, that constantly reminds us that none of us are perfect, that we all make bad choices that jeopardize our own sanity, our own health, and consequently takes the toll on the community and our families. Anybody, again, who's mature knows this, especially if you're in a mature relationship. People talk about relationship being a give and take. It is. It's the constant process of forgiveness, back and forth, because we're constantly stepping on each other's toes. As human beings, we have very limited consciousness. Some people say, well, you know, people should be aware of this or people should be aware of that. I get that. I feel that frustration. I've often said we live in the free world. We're the cutting edge of consciousness. When I think about addiction, we've all been around long enough to see all the research. You know, we should know by now not to, you know, indulge in anything really, because it will lead to our demise. It will deplete us. And yet we do. And that's bizarre, I think, but it's reality. Here we are having this discussion around another epidemic of fentanyl overdose, opioids. This has been an old discussion, very old. But I want to say it's old because there's something ancient that we're talking about in the human psyche that people don't want to talk about. It's the elephant in the living room. So these are my thoughts right now, having come out of 3 days of webinars in addiction, also witnessing what's going on in the world, and living in the free world where we seem to be losing more and more our freedoms. And again, I'm concerned about the lack of maturity we see in our leadership right now. That our leadership does not understand the very nature of what it means to be human. That we all make self-depleting, shall I say, self-destructive choices. And we all must bear that burden. None of us has, what do you want to call it, the, you know, the holiness, if you will. People say, you know, often use the term holier than thou. None of us have the right to set up camp and say, you know, someone doesn't deserve our compassion. Someone doesn't deserve the best of our services. How are they so different than me? They may be making this choice, but I'm making this choice over here. You know, we also know as mature people that comparison is an immature exercise. People might say, well, compared to, you know, I'm great compared to so-and-so, or so-and-so is, you know, using fentanyl, but I'm not doing that, you know. And so they compare themselves, and then they make that person worse. And then they realize that, hey, you know what, but I've made a mess of my life in some other area. Or maybe their life is going well. Instead of feeling blessed, This person has become arrogant. Again, a sign of immaturity. So I'm going to leave this conversation here. Hopefully it's given you something to think about. If I were to give you anything, like I said, take away, and I know you're interested in being a mature person and you're interested in understanding the wisdom teachings that have been given to us for thousands of years, then you've got to understand and desire to understand, again, that we all fall short. We're all imperfect. That we have to bear each other's burdens if we want to live in a free world. That's just the way that it is. Freedom and, if you will, creativity, it's been said, is a messy job. Innovation, creativity requires freedom of thought, freedom of choice. It's a messy job. That's why oftentimes people say, the American experiment, they're amazed that it's gone this far. I mean, it is a true balance of many different kinds of things, many different ideologies. But the core idea, again, is that we're all, we all fall short of what? Well, in the American philosophies, we all fall short of God. In God we trust. We place ourselves in the presence of God. And when we're in the presence of God, we see our shortcomings and it keeps us in check. I've done videos on this, and saying humility is the great equalizer. Einstein said that, that as we stand before God, we are all equally foolish. And he was an atheist. So there's something to it, folks. So give it some thought. I look forward to your comments and what's going on in your family and in your mind as you think about what's going on in the world, what's going on in our country. Have a wonderful holiday. Have a wonderful Christmas. Let's all pray, if you will, that this thing called COVID will soon diminish itself to the degree that folks will no longer lose their lives or go through tremendous suffering. And let's pray for our leaders that they make good choices. There's some wonderful, sounds like breakthrough medications and preventative things that are coming out soon. There have also been some preventative measures that have already existed that leadership has yet to give its authorization to. I mean, in my opinion, we should be doing all in our power to take a preventative approach, be open to all possibilities, and to not have those controlled or denied. But there seems to be some promising preventions on the horizon, and so let's pray that those come out quickly, that our leaders allow that to happen, and and that we all stay healthy, and that we all continue to pursue knowledge and wisdom and humility, of course. Ho, ho, ho. Take care, guys. Bye.